percent? Do I give you a lower percent? Okay, only one of the 3 smartphones said technology is number 1. The other 2, quality, delivery. Okay, all right. So this is quite unusual. That's probably not a norm in the industry. And so notice how technology is not as important at the delivery decision, but it's very important in the supplier selection decision. The whole electronics industry is characterized by decreasing what? Costs. Okay, so we're talking about the semiconductor, the technology and things like that. The costs are always decreasing. So there's a norm in the industry, especially in smartphones, to have a cost reduction of 5% every quarter minimum. So if the contract for 1 year, I can only specify there's a fixed cost because I agree with the supplier, or 2.8 inch, so we're talking about LCM module. I'm asking about quarterly cost reduction of 5%, so the number is adjustable all of the time. See, that is not in the contract. That is in a constant communication process after. Okay? Most of the contracts are about technological capability. All right? Can you be the supplier? Not can you reduce costs? Okay, so they work on, this is a quarterly backwards and forwards every quarter. So I'm asking to reduce the costs, they cut their material costs, they cut their overhead expenses, might come back with 13% reduction again. So normally we do not specify the volume, the pricing, and some of the conditions in the contract. So notice that these big buyers are very big on the post-contract management of the suppliers. And so I'm not going to read out all of that. I'm going to, sometimes the probation is 6 months. For example, a supplier goes down from A, B down to C, the probation is 6 months, and then they might audit again and assign someone to visit their factory. So they've got people visiting the factory. It's part of the monitoring process, part of the auditing process. This is after becoming approved. This is not before. This is after, and it's a constant. It is amazing how it works. So let me just, we're still moving ahead. Okay, we're good. I've already mentioned a lot of subjectivity in allocation process. Why? You've got many suppliers, you've got lots of criteria, and they're collecting information every month. Okay, so basically what I said then with the performance measurement summary is the selection and purchase criteria are similar for cost-focused firms. And not so much for the smartphone manufacturers. The smartphone manufacturers spend a bit more time on the quality, on the technology in the selection, and less on technology on the purchase order management process. All right, let me show you a real case study. And I really appreciate, like PQI is a major manufacturer in Taiwan. They make the USBs, you know the USBs. And so we've really appreciate them because they've granted us opportunity to write a case study on how they manage their suppliers. And that's also available through the Harvard Case Clearinghouse. So what we're saying here for PQI, they have a monthly assessment. We have research and development, purchasing, we have quality control. And notice for research and development, what is the key operative word on all of the criteria that they use when they're evaluating a supplier? What is it? Capability, capability, capability. All right, so what about purchasing? Let's go back one. Is the supplier willing to supply frequently? Willing, willing, willing. Notice the difference? So different departments care about different things, about capability of the supplier. Okay, these companies are so large, they have so many suppliers. Okay, they have departments and they have consultants that come in and to bring the departments together. All right, what about quality and control? Documentation, documentation, documentation. How many of you like doing documentation? Okay, no one. Okay, I understand. All right. Okay, so that gives you some of the flavour of what's, like that's the real performance measures or the documentation that is used by these various departments in PQI. And that's not much different from other large buyers that we have visited. Okay, but what you've got to realise at the end, when you get to the end, we've got to put them all together. And once we start putting in costing, delivery, management, quality, relationship, there's a lot of dimensions here. And then you have 3 suppliers, and some suppliers are good on some and bad on others. what do you do? Right? That's a big, so it's a real information overload dilemma. We're working with a large smartphone manufacturer at the moment in actually analysing that and trying to help them work through their decision processes. So more about that next year when we finish that study. So what other practices, here's what they do. Number one, they do other practices. Okay? They do it in terms of supplier selection, having a second supplier, every component, bottleneck component. So in supplier selection, some of these smartphone manufacturers, some of them, okay, here's what happens in the supplier section. Some of you have worked with China suppliers. You'll have a design, you ask for a sample. Okay, we all know that, all right? That's the same thing that happens with the large buyers. What some of the large buyers do is say, don't show me the sample. We will send some engineers to your factory and we're going to watch you make the sample. Okay? Don't show me the sample. We want to watch you make the sample. Okay? And in the process, they may say, oh, show us your management system. And that's what happened for a Taiwanese company. They got a contract with a large smartphone manufacturer. The managers came, the engineers came, not only saw the processes, their quality documentation, but also show us your management system. And this Taiwanese company was so proud because they had a balanced scorecard, intricate balanced scorecard in place. And the people from this large buyer were blown away. They were just so impressed. It was a huge signal that this Taiwanese company had its management in order, not just its factory in order, but its management in order. And so that's another interesting way of communicating to large buyers if you're a supplier about how to get your house in order, how to communicate, how to signal that you are good, not just in the factory floor. Not all suppliers are the same. And second supplier. It's really interesting. I was talking to one large buyer. Okay, so we have lots of components in a smartphone like this. Okay, so some of these are passive components, some of these are generic, there's IC, there's lots of components here, right? So some of these are critical, right? So no, they're all critical. I said, well, what about the screen? Critical. What about the case? It's critical. What about the antenna? Critical. What about the battery? Critical. Is there anything that's not critical? Oh yes, the packaging. And that was the mentality. That was the mentality of the buyer. That was the mentality of the large buyer. And that comes from culture from the top management down. Okay? So even though all these large buyers are doing lots of these things I talk about here, there's some that are more extreme than others in terms of how they view the product that they are making. Every component, bottleneck component, some of them felt that the bottleneck component was the most critical part. Okay, and you know through operations management that's an important thing to focus on. Okay, the buyer power and information sharing. Very interesting. I talked to one large buyer that had lots of power, global power, and leadership in the phone manufacturing, and they have lots of suppliers in China. They were able to get yield information. If you ask these large buyers, what is the thing that suppliers won't share with you but you would like them to share with you? And a lot of these large buyers said to me, it's the yield. If I know the yield, then I'm in a better position to negotiate on price. Okay? Because you understand that, if you're manufacturing, how many of you have done some operations management study or anything like that? So, I'm an accountant by trade, but accounting is just a representation of the engineering reality, right? And the engineering reality is measured by yield, efficiency, things like that, right? So when we talk about the yield, ultimately we're talking about cost. If I can improve the yield by 10%, then I can weather a cost reduction by so much percent, right? If I'm a supplier, I don't want to tell my buyer that my yield's improved by 10%. I don't want to tell them that. Why? Because then the buyer will want to share half. They'll just come back with more cost reductions. So suppliers are not willing to share that yield change. But for this large manufacturer, they were able to extract it out of the suppliers because, how did you do it? And they said, oh, because we have the power. Okay, we monitor the process. We actually control the materials going into the factory too. So we control the inputs, we monitor the process, we see the outputs, so we can calculate the yield. But for another large manufacturer, they weren't able to do that because they didn't have the power. So buying power is a big thing. And some of that power is entwined in the symbolic capitalism that suppliers think they get by being an approved supplier for this wonderful buyer that has this worldwide brand name. Okay? But the buyer uses that power to extract information. Okay? So this is what's going on in China, especially with these large buyers. So we have cost management practices, purchasing managers. Okay, we have one buyer. So we're talking about negotiation, we're talking about information sharing. Okay, so how else are large buyers getting around this information problem? Another way is they make sure their purchasing managers have an engineering background. Wow. So, for example, this is a case. Have you seen a case like this before? Can you buy this downtown? Well, it's an iPhone. This is not an iPhone case, right? This is a case for a hard drive. So, a 500 gigabyte, 1 terabyte hard drive, okay? You're with me there. So a supplier makes this case. So a large buyer that uses this case in their product, their purchasing manager came into the interview and demonstrated in 20 minutes how much it costs the supplier to make that. Demonstrated with a ruler, grabbed all this product, did all the ruling, did calculations, worked backwards. How'd you do that? Oh, because I worked for this major manufacturer in Taiwan for the last 15 years. And so buyers get around this information problem by having purchasing managers that have an engineering background. And not just an accounting background or not just a sales background, but engineering background. So by having that information, if I can work backwards and work out how much it costs the supplier, you see, the material costs is not an information asymmetry problem. It's the tooling costs. It's the tooling costs that suppliers may not completely reveal to the buyer. They may say to the buyer it costs more than what it really does. Okay, unless the buyer really knows the industry well, the purchasing managers know that too, then they really cannot succeed in the negotiation. Right? You can always work out the material cost because that's a variable cost. The tooling is fixed and it becomes very negotiable. So this buyer the purchasing manager worked out in 20 minutes how much the tooling costs were. And why do they want to work it out? Because when they go into negotiation, they know what the supplier's cost base is. Real cost base, not what the cost base the supplier tells you. You see the difference? Okay. So the last 10 minutes I've been talking about that information game. Okay. Earlier on I talked about what formalities they do, that's performance measurement. And then I've given you some stories about the information game. This is how some buyers get around that information asymmetry. And they do in very different ways. One through power, one by having purchasing managers that have that background, engineering background. So I tell my students, you must do a major in accounting and engineering. You should. Don't do accounting and finance. That's not creative. It may be creative, but it doesn't add value. Okay? Engineering has so much potential in many other areas of business, services, than what we realise. We think engineers just belong in the factory. Okay. So that's one of my things I've learned. All right, another large buyer uses a cost leadership measure. What's that? What does that mean? It's an incentive that when we go for negotiation every quarter, okay, you tell us. If you tell us the price that you want us to pay, if you tell us that, well, this is a fair price and here's some evidence that this is the same price I've given to other buyers, then we will reward you. So this cost leadership measure is used by this large company to actually reward their suppliers for actually sharing information. So by doing a self-audit, Okay, so traditionally what we do, we get auditors in to double check, cross check, do due diligence to say, are we really paying too much or not? Can we check the market? This company doesn't do that. They actually reward the suppliers that voluntarily share that information. Okay, so they're using an incentive mechanism. Very interesting, right? Taiwanese company. What do other companies do to get around this information problem? Well, they'll have many manufacturing plants. So one company has 14 manufacturing plants, 7 in China, 7 in Taiwan, and they will benchmark between the factories. You know, our Taiwanese, very high productivity, and they'll try to get Chinese factories up to that level of productivity. We asked one of these buyers, okay, we see a lot of engineering technology leadership coming out of Taiwan, especially on the production, okay, going into China. There's a lot of that happening. So how long will it take for China to get to that level as Taiwan, okay, in terms of production technology on the factory? We're talking about operations, yields, things like that. And they're talking about just 5 or 6 years. It wasn't a decade or more. So things are happening very fast in China. And a lot of that's partly due to a lot of the Japanese, the Korean, Taiwanese owned factories that are in China and helping that learning gap even faster. Okay. So there's a lot more Taiwanese owned factories in China now than there were 10 years ago. Right? One big buyer had factories in China, Malaysia and Philippines, and when they got an order they decided, we'll throw 50% there and we'll throw 30% here and 20% there. They didn't locate the production of an order in one factory, and they did that to spread their risk. Spread their risk of logistical problems, weather, things like that. Okay. All right. So what I've talked about then was cost management. Okay, so, and how they manage the costs. They have lots of suppliers, different locations, do benchmarking, they have incentives, okay, and then they have purchasing managers with engineering background to work backwards themselves. Okay, all right, so what about cross-country comparisons? Now we're tapping into my recent study where we've done these 600 plus interviews, and we asked them, we only asked these suppliers about their largest customer only. And we're interested in if the customer is from China, Europe, USA, or other Asia. Okay, I've grouped it together. In terms of acceptable responses here, we've got N of 608. By any standard, that is a large number. Okay, you look at any article that's in the Wall Street Journal that quotes things like this, or any consulting study, it's usually less than 100. Okay, we have 608, and we asked them the importance of qualification routines, country of origin. Notice USA, if you have a USA customer, very high on technology. That makes sense, yes? Very high on production efficiency, very high on service. Okay, very interesting. All right, there's some more about that in a minute. Let's move from the qualification routine to the performance measurement. Now, remember we go from the supplier selection, now we're moving to the purchase order decision, okay? It's not the selection decision, this is the purchase order decision. What do you focus on the most? Well, if your customer is from the US, technology is still very high compared to if the customer is from Europe, okay? All right, so I'm not saying that there's differences in all these areas, but there are some point differences here, like Europe is very big on the delivery, okay, and not so much on costs. So what's the takeaway here? Well, the takeaway for suppliers, when I talk to the suppliers, is you want to internationalise, you're probably going to do it faster if you have a US customer. They're probably going to pressure you more, but you'll probably learn faster. And you'll probably you just learn through that learning cycle faster, right? Okay, what about performance measurement accuracy? What do we ask here? This is, all right, think about it, okay? You have a contract with a large customer. You got that because of many things. You got that because you had the capability. You got that because you had the quality documentation. You got that also because you may have the systems in place. This is about the systems in place. and what you're measuring very well, what you're not measuring very well. Well, interesting, if you have a customer from USA, you are measuring your technology much higher. You are measuring your costs more accurately than if you have customers from other countries. Okay? If you have a customer from Europe, you're measuring your service more accurately. This is the supplier's own system. Okay? Just the final, and there's some statistics here, but this is really, really interesting here, because what I did before is just a graph, okay? So how do you know it's significantly different, all right? So, but from a statistics point of view, here are different questions we have on supplier relations. Notice, I've broken out the other Asia into Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, so it becomes even more interesting. Notice our US customer is much higher on importance of customer acquiring manufacturing process technology. This is what the supplier's response is, much higher on this for the US compared to China, South Korea. Okay? If they have a Taiwanese customer, it's still very high. Japan customer, even higher. Okay? You with me on that? So there's some of the differences here. Importance of speeding up customers' new product development. Okay, this is what the supplier responds to its major customer. All right, we ask them, what is the importance of your major customer in speeding up the new customer's product development? So the customer from which country cares most about this? USA, okay, Japan, South Korea. Okay. So there are very interesting comparisons we've got here. So this is more of like an international country comparison. That this is the first time that anyone in public has seen this data. It's only analysed last week based on our 600 plus analysis. All right, let's move on to selection and monitoring practices. Okay, remember I talked about we select the supplier, they're approved. We give purchase orders, and then we send the cavalry in to monitor the suppliers. Well, the use of visits to supplier in the selection, definitely US, Taiwan, Japan. Okay, compared to Europe and China. Okay, importance of productive efficiency, US and Taiwan, South Korea. So really, what's coming out here is that US and some of the Asian tiger countries, so we're looking at Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, definitely have much more rigorous monitoring than Europe and Chinese customers. Okay, so we're not talking about owners. We're not talking about owners of the factory. We're just talking about customers that are supposed to be at an arm's length. And what are they doing? They're monitoring. What I mean by monitor, it's not on the phone, it's people visiting and watching you make. People visiting, it's not just paying a third-party inspector to come and inspect your goods before they put in the container. This is monitoring the process. This is sending people to the supplier and actually watching. Okay, it's not the final step of the checking. Right? So this is what's really interesting about the large buyers. Well, of course, they have the capital to do that power. And of course, there's monitoring at frequency of supervision, frequency of training, frequency of meeting, frequency of communication. Guess what? Guess who is higher? USA. Okay, Taiwan, bigger than Europe and other. Japan is quite big. South Korea is quite big, especially when frequency of supervision or monitoring by the major customer, sending people to the supplier, compared to Europe and China. Very interesting. So I tell suppliers, it's going to kill you, but just work with US, try and get a US customer. You'll probably learn faster. You may not make money in the short term, but you'll probably learn faster, go up that technology curve, and become even stronger in the long term. That's what I tell the suppliers. Okay. All right, so in summary, I covered the big picture, but in that big picture, I first started talking about, okay, who cares about suppliers? Well, we should care about what the suppliers think. We need to care about that before we think about, well, what's in it for us as buyers. And a lot of these big buyers are working very closely with the suppliers. And one of the big things to take away from the study so far is that if you can help the supplier work with them to help their management technology, their production technology, then it's more likely to have a longer term relationship, because suppliers want to learn too. But at the same time, I showed you that when we look at the number one challenge facing these suppliers, a lot of them are just looking to the short term, and they just see cost as their challenge. They see competition as their challenge. But their real challenge should be how to move up that technology curve, how to innovate, how to do things that will overcome these cost problems in the long term. Okay? And so I have another presentation, I won't do it today, where I list out, here are all the challenges they faced. I'll present that to you today, those two big graphs. That's the challenge, all right? What are they doing? Okay, that's an interesting question. What are they doing to that challenge? So I've got all that information, putting that together and presenting another time. But only 16% said they are automating in response to the cost challenge. It's quite interesting. Automation, only 16%. 84% are not automating in response to a cost challenge. When we all know labour costs are only going in one direction, material costs are only going in one direction. Okay, so that's a big challenge for Chinese suppliers. More about that for another presentation. Let me just stop there and field any questions.
Can I ask about the 1,000 suppliers and how you selected them? What are the criteria? Were they all electronics suppliers? Were they of a certain size? Were they...
Very good question. They're all electronics. I focus on the electronics industry. Number one, I don't have the resources to do all industry, so I'll start somewhere.
Okay.
Electronics industry makes up 16+% of China's economy, so it's a substantial industry. And also, it's not a sunset industry. It's not going away because the ecosystem is pretty well established in China. So I chose that industry, and I looked at all of the product range in that industry. Passive components, generic components, PCBs, LCM modules, anything that goes into a phone, we did that. What is the criteria for selection? It is just a lot of it's convenience, because we go to all the electronics expos. We go to the trade shows and we will ask some questions. We will go, I have a video here, I could show that, but I don't want to waste your lunchtime. We're going to a trade show next week. I have a team of 14 interviewers at any one time. On average, about 4 or 5 of them come with me to a trade show, and I introduce them to the vendor, and the interviews go for up to an hour. These interviews are really long. We're talking about 115 questions. This is not a 15-minute consultant survey / marketing survey interview. Okay, this is a real in-depth. There's a lot of data here that I haven't even mined yet. Okay, because so how do we select it? We just go to booth by booth by booth.
So it's somewhat random.
Yeah.
Except for the fact that all of these...
It's not random, because I'm only selecting those suppliers that are at the expos.
That are at the expos, yes.
Okay, so granted, those suppliers that are expos are probably better than
The ones that aren't.
that aren't, right? But most of these suppliers are second-tier suppliers. Okay, to give you an idea that 3.5 weeks ago, Apple released its list of major suppliers that make up 94+% of its purchasing amount. Okay, and you think, oh, that's all their suppliers. They've got 154. That's their first tier. Okay, they did not release the list of their second and third tier. Our study, we're focusing on the second tier. All right, and maybe a third tier suppliers. So third tier, things like material suppliers, chemicals, we're talking about raw materials. Second tier, they buy from them and make them into passive components, IC chips, okay, covers, plastics, connectors, PCB manufacturers. So we're looking at all those second tier suppliers. So it's not random, but it's big, 1,000. We want to do 1,000.
And so you haven't done any analysis in terms of looking at responses based on supplier size and scale? That could be quite interesting.
Okay, are the ones that do respond and ones that don't?
No, in terms of their responses. that the responses of the suppliers could be quite different depending on whether it's a...
Oh, absolutely, especially how they're responding to the major challenge.
Yeah.
Maybe the larger ones are able to automate, the smaller ones are not.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's I'm working on that now.
Okay, so that is something that you're also...
We can work on a study together on that.
It'd be quite interesting
Yeah.
to look at that.
Yes.
scale-wise.
But I'd love to be able to come back or even another forum to talk about that, and that's my next. I'm going to talk more about that, absolutely. But just a short note, the China Supply 1000, it will be the largest ever interview study.